let's talk about shutter speed. Hey fellow photographers, what did you shoot today? Let's talk about shutter speed. We talked a lot about aperture and how that lets light into the camera. Well, shutter speed is the second part of the exposure triangle that I would like to talk about. And essentially, it's a little bit simpler than aperture, because aperture had to deal with size of the opening, which was measured in area, right? So we got that weird square root of 2 factor from each f-stop number, f number, to the next f number. Well, time, luckily, is a linear function. So your shutter speed is linear. You keep the shutter open for twice as long, it's going to let in twice as much light. You let your faucet run for 1 minute versus 2 minutes, you're going to have twice as much water from that faucet if the flow rate is the same. Kind of like that. So your camera generally looks at shutter speed in terms of seconds. And starting with 1 second, if we half that, we get a ½ second shutter speed, and then we get a ¼ second, and then an 1/8 second. And you'd think we get a 16th second here, and we do if we keep cutting this in half, but your camera actually goes to 1/15 of a second, to 1/30th of a second, to 1/60th, to 1/125th. So it doesn't go to 120, it goes to 125. So these shorter and shorter shutter speeds represent, like we had before, stops of light. So 1 second of exposure gathers twice as much light as a ½ second of exposure, which gathers twice as much light as a ¼ second of exposure. And we can go the other way too. We can have 2 seconds, 4 seconds, 8 seconds, etc., etc. So each one of these shutter speeds is going to allow a certain amount of light into our picture. So why would we choose one over the other? Well, if we're in a low light situation and we have to gather more light, we're going to use a shutter speed that is longer to gather more light. Or if we want to freeze fast moving action, or there's a lot of light available, we want a fast shutter speed. And most digital cameras nowadays go up to about 1/8000th of a second. So they can be pretty quick. Most film mechanical cameras go between 1/1000th of a second and maybe 1/2000th of a second. And then we have things like electronic shutters that can read off different things because they're not necessarily looking at the mechanical aspect. They're not limited by the mechanical aspect of the camera. They do some wizardry when it comes to reading the amount of light off the sensor. So we're going to talk about those in future videos. There's different types of shutters. There are shutters that are inside the lens, usually called leaf shutters. There are focal plane shutters, which stand in front of the sensor or the film, right in front of the focal plane. And there are electronic shutters, like I mentioned. The important part is that if you want to capture fast-moving objects, you're going to have to go to the faster end of the spectrum. And if you want some motion blur as a creative effect, or you want those nice dreamy seascapes with the water that kind of looks like fog, you're going to go with longer exposure times. The issue is that by letting in more or less light, then we have to balance this with our other parts of the exposure triangle. And we talked about aperture, so I'm going to bring aperture into play here just to give you an example. So let's just say that for a correct exposure where everything is, and we haven't talked about exactly what a correct exposure is, but something that you're happy with and it gives you a good tonal range of the entire scene, gives you good dynamic range everywhere. Let's say that that happens at 1 second of shutter speed and coupled with an aperture of f8. Well, let's say that we didn't want to expose for 1 second because we wanted to have freeze the motion, so we wanted a faster shutter speed. Well, just like each movement this way is one stop, if we want to couple the exposure between shutter speed and aperture, if we want this to remain constant exposure throughout, if we let in half as much light here with the ½ second shutter speed, we have to let in twice as much light here. Now remember, letting in twice as much light, this doesn't mean double this to 16. Remember that the smaller the aperture number, like we discussed in previous videos, the larger the opening, and then the stops actually go by a power of square root of 2. So the next step down from f8, if we open up our lens, smaller f number, wider aperture is going to be f5.6. And again, it's going to be f4. If we go another stop, and another stop after that is going to be f2.8. And then f2, and then f1.4. Right, so we keep moving down one stop, letting in half as much light, but we're letting in twice as much light in the aperture, so it stays the same. So half as much here, twice as much here, cancels out. So we have this sort of trend. Now, you might notice something, right? Maybe I have a really fast lens, right? f1.4, wide aperture, able to capture a lot of light. But still, I'm at 1/30th of a second, which in all photography terms is not necessarily the fastest of speeds. See, then we run into a problem. And then we have to consider what is going on in our scene. And the third part of the exposure triangle, which we're going to talk about in future videos, is going to be the amount of light available, the luminance, or illuminance if you want, of the scene. So we can either start filling this and adding more light artificially with flash to get the things that we want. So these are all trade-offs. Photography always has trade-offs. So in aperture, we discussed the f-stop trade-off, right? If we go to a wider aperture, bigger aperture, smaller f number, we got shallower depth of field. So we didn't get as much in focus as if we used a higher aperture. So gathering more light cost us the expense of having less in focus. Maybe we want that look, that's fine, but we have to know it as a trade-off. If we want something in a really, really, really bright sunlit day, but we want that shallow depth of field, we might not be able to get there using aperture, right? Because it's a trade-off. If we go very, very far and have a very small opening, small hole, small aperture, large f number, then we're going to get large depth of field. We're not going to get the subject isolation that we would. Same thing with shutter speed. Shutter speed, we get more and more light the longer we leave the camera open, the longer the time is, which is usually good for exposure, especially in low light situations, but that gives us allows us to introduce things like motion blur. The longer it goes, and if you're trying to take a picture of someone or you're trying to keep your hands still, it's harder the longer that the shutter is open. So we trade off motion, being able to freeze the action or being able to get non-blurry pictures, trying to combat our own shakiness. Likewise, we get less light. It'd be great to snap pictures at 1/1000th of a second. Everything is just frozen in the moment, tack sharp, right? But we might not get enough light given the scene. If it's a dark scene, taking a quick picture is not going to be able to capture enough light to get a usable photograph. So that's the trade-off on the other end. So photography is all about these trade-offs, especially between the shutter speed aperture combination. And ever since the dawn of photography, it's been this trade-off, right? Because the first cameras were extremely slow, right? They were using chemical-based processes that would and they would require a lot of light to come into that camera to make a photograph that was usable. So you'd have very, very long shutter speeds, and the lenses of the day were not that good. They were not, some of the lenses of the day, like the daguerreotype camera that came out was like an f13, not good at all for capturing light. So exposures would take, you know, minutes upon minutes, or even hours, or sometimes days. That's why the Petzval lens that we keep talking about was such a great modern invention, because this was, you know, f3.5, which at the time was, you know, 4 or 5 times faster, could gather that much more light than the older lenses. So as things improved, what really came first were the aperture settings, right? So faster and faster lenses, and then once the chemistry sort of caught up to the technology of the time, and we had faster and faster film speeds, or more and more sensitive photographic materials, you know, it used to be that you would just take your hat or your top hat or whatever, or your lens cap, and you just, you know, put it in front of the lens and then take it off, you know, and when you're done with the exposure, you just put it back on, and that was your exposure, because it was like 30 seconds. But then with the more and more sensitive materials, a finer and finer level of accuracy with the faster shutter speeds had to be developed. So we're going to go over all of that in future videos. This is a quick sort of primer that says, you know, hey, shutter speed, you know, you let light in twice as long, you get twice as much light. It's a pretty simple concept. So again, everything's a trade-off in photography, right? So we're going to talk about the trade-off differences between different types of shutters, including leaf shutters, pros and cons, focal plane shutters, pros and cons, and electric shutters, or electronic shutters, pros and cons. And it's not necessarily about what's best, it's what's best for you, and in understanding how each of them works in order to inform your buying decisions, and knowing the sort of the benefits and limitations of your gear, so that you can go out and get the pictures you want, or you have to take certain precautions or extra steps to get the look you want with the gear you have. So stay tuned for next week. We're going to go over types of shutters, and it should be pretty informative, because I think a lot of modern cameras have maybe electronic or focal plane shutters, and very few cameras have leaf shutters. but leaf shutters do offer some interesting advantages. So it should be an interesting video. So until then, as always, happy shooting.